Hi, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Divorce. Hey, today we're going to talk about the question of what do I do when my spouse is not in the same country as I am and I want to get divorced. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining.
Promise today, we're going to answer two questions. Can you get divorced if your spouse is in another country? And can you get divorced if you got married in another country? And today, we're lucky to have Brittany Doucette, a very experienced matrimonial lawyer, join us to answer those questions.
So the answer to the question of can you get divorced if you got married outside of Canada is yes. You have to meet a couple of requirements. The first is you have to have been legally married in whatever location you got married in. So you have to meet all of their requirements. The second requirement is that your marriage has to be legally recognized in Canada. Most marriages are, but we have a couple policy reasons why Canada as a country may not recognize marriage. The easiest example would be a polygamous marriage wouldn't be recognized in Canada. So you wouldn't be able to get divorced out of that kind of marriage because you're not legally married in the eyes of Canada. The second question of can you get divorced if your spouse is outside of Canada is again, yes. It just might be a little bit more complicated. And you have to meet some further requirements or worry about issues like service. One thing I will say though is that if you got married outside of Canada and you're now in Canada but you're not a Canadian resident, is that your residency status or your citizenship status doesn't matter as long as you meet the residency requirements to get divorced in Canada. So I'm going to talk about two major sets of hurdles about when you're trying to get divorced and your spouse is in a different country. The first is meeting residency requirements. In Canada, you have to be resident in a province for a year before you start a divorce application. So you have to have been living there. You can't just move into a province and then file for divorce immediately. There's one exception to this rule, is that if you were married in Canada and you can't get divorced in the country that you live in because that country won't recognize your marriage, you may be able to get divorced in Canada even if you haven't been resident here. The example of this would be same-sex marriages. Canada permits and recognizes same-sex marriages, but not all countries do. So if you were a same-sex couple who got married in Canada but live in a country that doesn't recognize them, you wouldn't be able to get divorced there. So you could apply in Canada in the province that you got married in for divorce even if you haven't been resident in that province for a year. The other hurdle, and probably the bigger hurdle, is going to be service. When you start a divorce application, you're going to have to serve your spouse. Serving is giving your spouse notice that a divorce application has been filed, and it's usually just providing them with the court documents. You have to be careful depending on what province you live in because each province sets out different requirements for service, and they have different ways that you can and can't serve. For example, in some provinces like Alberta, divorce applications on an initial basis should be served personally, which means that your spouse has to be handed a hard copy of the divorce application in person by a friend or a process server. Some other provinces allow you to serve via mail or fax, but you want to be very careful and you make sure you look at your province requirements before you get down that road. The problem comes if we're dealing with people in other countries is A, you may not know where they live, B, getting someone there to serve them might be difficult, or there might not be technological infrastructure available to allow for email service or internet easily. In this case, you may actually have to apply to court for a substitutional service order. This order, granted by a judge or master, depending on where you live, is an order that allows you to serve in a different way. For example, you may be allowed to serve via email, via Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter messages. We have seen that now in Canada, via text message, or even by posting a notice in a local newspaper. But you would need a court order to do that. The other hurdle you may actually have to look into, depending on what province you live in, is that not all provinces allow you to serve someone outside of the country without a court order. Alberta, again, is an example of this. You need a court order to serve outside of Canada. So you want to be careful and look into your province's requirements on service to make sure that you're going to have effective service and you're not going to run into problems later down the road.
Thank you for that great answer, Brittany, and thanks for joining me on an episode of Let's Talk Divorce. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you got some valuable information today. I know it was a bit dry, but we are talking about divorce. But please join us again. If you like this YouTube channel, please do subscribe and share it with those who you think might need some great, easy, and cheap advice.